Hello and welcome to the Power Within podcast. I'm your host, Laurie, and today I'm super thrilled to have Seb Bunney on the show. Seb, thank you so much for being here.
It's honestly my pleasure. I think we met in Calgary at a little meetup, and I really enjoyed kind of just maybe chatting a little bit, and I'm looking forward to this talk.
Awesome. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is nature a little bit. So I know that you were born in the UK, then you went over to New Zealand, and now you're in Canada. And you had said that you had dropped out of school at 14 to pursue your love of being a mountain bike trainer. So I want to know, for you at that young age, to want to be out and involved in nature, like how much nature time did you spend to begin with, and how impactful has nature been to you in your growth journey up to this point?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would say that nature has been like fundamental in my own personal journey. Being able to be connected to nature and being in our natural environment has allowed me to really like find out who I am. I grew up in the UK, and then my parents, one is British, one is a New Zealander. We moved to New Zealand, and that's really where I started to kind of find myself. And I kind of got lumped in with just kind of your everyday people in school. I met a couple friends that were interested in mountain biking, and from there it just kind of like grew. Spending time in nature, spending time in the forests, I felt connected to something much deeper than I had felt when I'm just kind of in with my normal friend group. And I realized that there's something here that really resonated with me. And when we ended up moving back to the UK in my kind of like early teenage years, I missed that. I felt as if the UK, as great as it is when it comes to history, there's very little nature. It's such a densely populated place. And I felt as if I was very much losing myself. And mountain biking to me was something that was really hard to pursue in the UK. And so I realized, okay, if I want to be able to kind of get connected with nature again, I have to kind of leave this place. And so at 14, I left and I moved to Canada. And I moved to the mountains. I live in the little ski resort of Whistler, and I still live in the little ski resort of Whistler. And I've felt that if it wasn't for mountain biking and if it wasn't for Whistler, I very much would not be where I am today. And when I look back from more of like the knowledge that I know now, I realized that there's so much evidence that supports like being in nature and grounding supports us being present. It supports us in being able to kind of unlock areas of our brain that we otherwise wouldn't be able to access. It supports us in having more clarity around our thought processes. And so I personally, whether it comes to being in nature from a sport perspective or just walking through nature, it has helped me understand the world. It has helped me kind of deepen my understanding of myself. And I think nature is such a huge part of kind of me and how I show up.
I know on one of the podcasts you were on, someone had asked, they were asking questions about where they can find you, and she had asked, or you're not on Instagram, and you had mentioned that you actually stopped using social media until you started Looking Glass. And you had mentioned briefly that it affected your mental health. And so this is something that I love to ask people about, because I know social media can be used as a tool, but I think a lot of it is like people projecting and showing things and trying to have an image of what life really is versus what it is. So I want to know, for you, when you decided to stop doing it, like mental health wise, what was it about for you that you knew that you had to take a break from that?
So, you know what? I'll take a different approach to the question, and that is, a few years back, I ended up meeting this guy that really like inspired me, and he's a hugely inspirational individual. And he ended up saying to me that the world in which we live in has an issue when it comes to goal setting. We tend to set goals around the 3 Ps, and the 3 Ps are possessions. So we want to own things. We want to own the nice car. We want to own the shoes. We want to have the iPhone. Possessions. Power. We want to be in positions of power. We want to be able to have the high-paying job, you name it. And then prestige. We want to kind of look the part. We want to kind of have that prestigious kind of air about us. And when we actually stop and ask ourselves the question, what is it that have been kind of my biggest kind of life-changing events? What have been my favorite moments throughout my life? None of them are prestige, power, and possessions. Yet we kind of set all of our goals around these 3 Ps. And instead, what we tend to kind of think about when we think about our favorite moments in our life, the things that have really kind of challenged us, are the 3 Cs: connections, So connecting with others, relationships, our partners, our friends, our family, contributions, giving back to society, committing to community, giving our time and energy for kind of bigger causes. Connections, contributions, and challenges, and then challenging ourselves, whether it's in sports or whether it's in relationships, you name it. And I think that the challenge with social media for me is that it puts so much weight on possessions, power, and prestige, and very little weight on connection, contribution, and challenges. And so we get sucked into this digital world that isn't necessarily an accurate representation of the world around us. And it causes mental health issues. For me personally, I found that when you've got 300, 400, 500 plus friends on social media, everyone is doing something amazing at some point. So it makes it seem like everyone is doing lots of amazing things except for you. And in reality, there's just that one friend out of the 400 who's done something amazing. And so it gives you a very skewed representation of the world around us. And so for me personally, when I stopped using social media, I became way more comfortable in my own skin. I became way more comfortable just showing up in life how I wanted to show up, because I wasn't trying to compete or compare to other individuals. And so for me, I highly recommend anyone who's using social media to just be very, very conscious about how we're using social media. There's obviously pros and cons to everything. And when it comes to my writing, when it comes to the educational side of things, social media has been invaluable. But when I notice myself mindlessly browsing, I notice the detrimental effects that social media has on my own mental health, which is why I kind of ended up really cutting back and stopped using many of the social media platforms I was on.
Now, you mentioned it's been instrumental with writing. So I love your book. I think it is fantastic, The Hidden Cost of Money. And I know that when I was getting everything together, I was so amazed when you had talked about how the whole thing, you had written it from November 2022 into November 2023, but you had said, I actually got everything. I think it was like between like 1 and 5 in the morning, you would wake up and like know the chapters. So you had it within like a month. Can you like talk about that process a little bit? Because I think that that's great to know. I know that you're a big note taker, and you had said collectively it was like 10 years of books, like in reading and research. But I think it's so fascinating that it came together so quick and you'd wake up in the middle of the night for that. So I want to hear about that a little bit more.
Absolutely. Oh man, this topic, not many people kind of discuss this topic, and I think it's a fascinating topic. And so I've always been interested in psychology. And when you go down the psychological route, many times people stumble upon a guy named Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, he talks a lot about how we have our consciousness, so our ability to show up and perceive the world around us. We have our unconsciousness, which stores a lot of our unknown behaviors, our childhood traumas, you name it, and they impact our consciousness. And then we have the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is like this knowledge base that we're all kind of tapped into. And so when people say, oh, I've got a download, oh, this information came to me and I don't really know where it came from, many times people tend to refer to the information is coming from the collective unconscious. Now, what's interesting is there's many, whether it's artists or creators, that have recognized this. And so I think it is it's Einstein and I think it is Picasso, and I could be wrong on that, but both of them recognized that their most profound moments of inspiration came just as they were waking. And just as they're waking, we supposedly have more, I think it's gamma waves in our brain frequency that allow us to tap into the collective unconscious at a better level. And so what they would do is they would take naps on the couch, and they would hold a set of keys in their hand above a metal tray. And as they fall asleep, they would open the hand and they'd drop the keys, and it would wake them up into this kind of this gamma state when they're tapping into that kind of deeper collective unconscious that kind of allows them to kind of download that information. Well, when I started writing The Hidden Cost of Money, I came into it with one chapter. I had the first chapter, which actually never ended up being in the book in the first place. But I ended up coming into it with one chapter and was like, oh man, where do I really want to take this? And at the time, my dog, I have a husky who's now like kind of 9 years old, so she would have been kind of 7, 8 years old at the time. And she had like a stomach issue and she needed to go to the bathroom like 3 or 4 times a night. And so every like 2 hours, she would need to go to the bathroom for this like 2-week period, just as I started writing this book. And initially I was just like, oh my God, this is so annoying. This is like, I just want to sleep so I can focus on writing. But what I found very quickly is she kept on waking me up into this like state. And I was like, this needs to be chapter 2. This needs to be chapter 3. Oh, here's the key points of chapter 4 and 5. And within this 2-week period, I had the whole thing mapped out between the hours of like 1 o'clock in the morning and like 5 o'clock in the morning, just from being repeatedly woken into this state. And it was profound because I would come up out of a sleep state into this awake state, and all of a sudden the information was just there. And the narratives and how everything weaved together was very clear to me. And then during the day, I would take this information and expand on it and kind of add the text to it and then add supporting evidence. But it was, up until that point, like, people talk about the collective unconscious. We talk about how we have these inspirational moments, or that we go to bed and sometimes wake up with the answer. But that's the first time in my life that I had it repeatedly, day after day after day. And I started to see we very much do have the capacity as individuals to tap into this collective unconscious. And the amount of information that is there is profound. And there's many books, even when you dig into it, that are supposedly written through downloads, whether you're talking about like the Untethered Soul and Michael Singer's books. Like, there's many books that talk about this, and I find it a fascinating subject because there's a lot more to our knowledge than just the information at which we consume.
I love that. And Michael Singer, I had read, not the Untethered Soul, but there was the other...
The Surrender Experiment?
The Surrender Experiment, yeah. And
yeah.
I was so fascinated, like, just reading that and his whole process that he went through, because I find, like, a lot of, like, the people who write and experience that coming from, like, that state, I find that the books are more fascinating and also, like, more understandable on a different level too. So I love that, and I think that that's really fascinating. And I want to ask you, with that process of writing, where you just talked about how you would you'd put together the chapters, and then you would during the day you would go ahead and write. A lot of times financial stuff can be really dry and really boring, and so you bring in a lot of, like, human element to the book, and that's something that I found right away when I started reading it. I'm like, oh, this is really great. I can, it's not boring me, and I'm going from page to page, because you did bring in that human element that kind of keeps people turning the page going, okay, this affects me and I can understand it from this perspective. So I want to ask you, like, I know that you said unconsciously that's how you knew that you wanted to write the book, but was there, like, a specific audience that you had when you were writing that book to be able to put those human elements into it so it didn't turn out dry and just all finance?
No, and that's a great question. And I think when I went into it, I very much want to write for the layperson, the average individual, because there are phenomenal books on almost every single subject, especially when we talk about money, but 99% of them are very jargon heavy. Like, you either have to have an understanding of finance, you have to have an understanding of economics, macroeconomics, monetary flows, and all of this stuff is too much for the average individual who has never dove into these subjects before. And from my perspective, I realize, whether it's from looking back at my childhood and how money has impacted my parents, all the way through to my career and how money has impacted me, I've realized how profound and important money is in society, and how it really does weave its influence into every aspect of our living being and the environment around us. And so what I really wanted to try and convey through the book was how money influences the world around us and how it alters our ability to show up more authentically. And so when we have broken money, given that I believe that everything is downstream of money, we all feel the effects. And so what does sound money, or money that actually support us, look like? And what would be the benefits of such money? And so that's what I really, really want to try and achieve throughout the book. And one of the things, like, talking about kind of bringing it back to the average individual, when we talk about money, people many times cannot even describe what is money. They can't answer that question of what is money outside of, well, it's just a medium of exchange. You exchange it back and forth to buy things. They don't really have much more depth in that. And the way that I started to see money through my own readings, digging into psychology, childhood, trauma, you name it, I started to see money as so much more than that. I started to see it as, well, money really is a medium of expression, like language. It's how we express to the world what it is that we value. So with language, we express what we value through words. With money, we express it through purchases. And you can see this in action. If you walk into a grocery store and someone is buying grass-fed meat and organic vegetables, and then another person is buying cigarettes and candy, you can see what they value by what they purchase. And so when you actually just take a look at, like, a whole economy, you're able to see, based on where money flows, what it is that society values. So if money is flowing towards, like, really good high quality foods and domestic production, then you can see people value their local economy. People value high quality foods. If you see money flowing towards pharmaceuticals and poor quality foods, then you can see people, that's not what they value. But the challenge, like language, is that we can also be censored. And so with money, we have things like inflation. When the government prints more money, it is at our expense as the currency holders. So our purchasing power decreases, costs start to rise. And so all of a sudden, our purchasing power that we once had, the government is able to spend that purchasing power where they see fit. So we go and work hard, and then all of a sudden costs rise, but they're printing capital and they're funding things like war. And so the challenge is, if I as an individual do not support war, I'm not going to direct my money towards war. I'm never going to express my values as supporting war. But the government can devalue our purchasing power, capture our purchasing power and spend it on war. And then when you look at the economy on the whole, you're like, lots of money is going towards war. That must mean society values war, which is not true. And so inflation, it distorts where capital flows in society. And then you have things like regulations. In certain countries, you're not allowed to spend money on certain things. You're not allowed to direct money towards certain industries or certain areas. And not only that, you've got the government stepping in and funding certain industries in certain areas that wouldn't exist if we had more of a free market, if you just allowed capital to flow to where value is being created. And then lastly, you have things like capital controls. If you live in China and you want to try and protect your family by saving and investing in foreign assets because you realize that, hey, if I save in Chinese assets, well, I'm going to lose my purchasing power, so I'm not going to be able to support my kids. Well, they've got capital controls that prevent you from moving that money outside of China. So by keeping that money inside of China, they can continually devalue the currency at your expense, but for their benefit to fund their operations, regardless of whether you agree with them. And so the challenge we face with money today is it doesn't represent what people actually value. We can't express ourselves wholeheartedly through our money because of regulations, because of capital controls, because of inflation. And what's interesting is if I bring it back to kind of psychology, if as a kid we were not able to express our emotions wholeheartedly, let's say our parents didn't agree with anger, they didn't agree with sadness, they just wanted you to be happy. So anytime you were sad or anytime you were angry, they would suppress that emotion. Well, as an adult, we would grow up unknowingly, we would not have that ability to express certain emotions. Well, what is depression? Depression is the depressing of emotions. It's because we were never learned to express certain emotions as a child, and we don't know how to express those things as an adult. And so I would argue that many of the byproducts we face in society today are the byproducts of basically monetary depression. We don't know how to express ourselves in certain aspects, and money doesn't represent what society values.
I was going to ask you about that because I've heard you mention that, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other night, and we were kind of talking about that, like where you put your money is, what you value. And she's like, I don't agree with that, Laurie, right now, because she's like, I'm a single person, and it's almost impossible to live affordably now. And she's like, so where I used to eat more organic and healthy stuff, she's like, I know that I'm sacrificing my health, but I have to look at it from a bigger picture of, can I afford to eat for the week, or do I just want to buy things for a couple days? And one of the things that there was a little bit of confusion on is like, and I've heard this with conversations with other people, and I understand the inflation a bit more, and I've come to understand money, because I used to be someone who would look at this from this perspective too, of, well, all these corporations are greedy and it's their fault, but it's really not their fault, because it is the inflation that's causing this. And what you're seeing now too, and you actually had an article on your Looking Glass website, it was where more isn't
better, inflation
yes.
in the 21st century. Yeah.
Yes, and you touch on how now businesses and stuff too will either up their quality or they'll lower their quality and keep it the same. And I know that my sister and I were talking about this because she just purchased a home a couple years ago, and she bought all of her appliances brand new, and her refrigerator is done. And she called the repair guy, and he was like, well, during COVID, there was a shortage of people, so they put in a bunch of crap products, and they know that the fridges are all gonna kind of go out. They're just hoping that it'll make it through the warranty period. And so I remember growing up, we used to have those refrigerators that they're probably still working now in some places that could outlast human beings. And I want to know what your thoughts are on, like, how do we fix that to get back to these products? Because you're talking about free market, but there really isn't a free market anymore. So how do we fix that so that we can get back to having quality products? We can get back to like living a life that our money aligns with our values.
Absolutely. And so to kind of like quickly just answer kind of your friend's response, that is, most people respond in that way because that's all they know. They see prices rising whereby they cannot actually afford to spend money where it is that on what it is that they value. And that's totally understandable. But I think sometimes we struggle to see the big picture, which is, well, why is that happening? And it's happening because of the intervention. This is one of the byproducts of a broken monetary system. We cannot direct our money to what it is that we value, whether that is inflation, capital controls, regulations, or the fact that it's just too costly to do so. And the reality is that as a society, if you think about it, like let's just take an apple. An apple from 200 years ago, to be able to produce that apple, you would only be able to grow in the summertime. You would have to basically plant these seeds by hand. You'd have to till the soil without machinery. You'd have kind of horse and cart and plows. You'd have to protect the land, make sure that birds aren't kind of eating the seeds. You would then have to nurture that crop. Then you'd hand pick that crop and then horse and cart take it to the market. There is so much time and energy involved in creating one apple. Now we're able to grow year round with greenhouses. We've got pesticides and fertilizers, whether you agree with them or not. We've got pesticides and fertilizers that absolutely amplify the amount of produce that we can create. And then you have these greenhouses that protect it from kind of pests, protects it from birds, you name it. And then when we do create that apple, we're able to put it on trucks and transport it halfway across the world at a fraction of the cost of moving fruit and vegetables through horse and cart. And so what you realize is that technological advancement has advanced so much, but at the same time, the cost of an apple over the last 150 years has gone up 5,400%. So you're asking this question, if we've advanced so much in our technology and we've increased our efficiency and our ability to do things, yet costs have risen, what is happening? Why is this happening? Shouldn't prices be falling? Because if you look at our efficiency between a horse and a cart and a car, if you look at the efficiency between like greenhouses and non-greenhouses, like we've been able to amplify our production and efficiency, yet prices have risen. And that's a result of monetary printing. When we print more dollars, when we add more units of currency into society, with more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, prices rise. And so what people, I think, struggle to comprehend is that if we had a currency with a fixed supply of units, as society increased productivity, as society increased our capacity to create, as society became more innovative, prices would fall over time. And so as prices fell, we as individuals would have greater capacity to show up how we want. We could spend our money where we see fit. We'd be incentivized to save. We'd be able to pursue the things that motivate us. And so I think that this is where, under a world where we have a fixed supply of currency, all of a sudden we have greater capacity to show up more authentically. We have greater capacity to direct our capital to where we see fit. And what's interesting is, in order to be able to move towards such a world, I think we need two things. I think one, we need to have a currency with a fixed supply, because that currency is going to represent what society values more wholeheartedly. The analogy that many kind of like-minded individuals kind of give is, at the moment, what is money? Well, money is a representation of what people value in society. Its value is based upon what kind of the goods and services in society. But the problem is, if you're constantly printing more currency units, then that's distorting its value. And so if you're a builder and you go and try and build a building, and your measurement unit, so let's say you're using inches, your inch is changing measurement each time you use it, do you think your building is going to be structurally sound? No, it's not going to be structurally sound at all. And so at the moment, our currency is a poor unit of measurement because it's constantly being diluted. It's constantly having more and more currency units printed, so it doesn't measure anything very well. It distorts our ability to be able to see what society values. Whereas when you have a fixed supply of currency units, as society increases its productive capacity, as we add more services, as we add more goods, as we grow as a society, then prices fall because there's a fixed amount of units while there's more services, more goods, you name it. And so I think that in order to be able to kind of move towards such a world, we need to have a fixed supply, and we also need to be able to separate money from state or kind of central planners. Because the problem is humans, which it is a huge benefit in a free market, are self-interested. People are always going to pursue things that interest them. But in a free market, if you pursue something that interests you but doesn't offer value to society, no capital is going to flow towards you. You can create the most perfect product that fixes your life, but it doesn't support anyone else. If it doesn't interest anyone else, then no money is going to flow towards you. Whereas in a free market, if you think about yourself and what it is that you value, but then you're able to create something that creates value for others, capital is going to flow towards you. Now, the challenge we face is when we have a monetary system, that there are central planners, there are individuals that govern this monetary system, they are self-interested. And that self-interested party is going to change regulation, change the operations of this monetary system based upon their needs. And so this has created the world in which we live in, where we're funding wars endlessly. We're devaluing the currency, creating massive wealth inequality. We're disincentivizing saving because our purchasing power is decreasing. And so I think we need to separate money from state and separate it from central planners so that our money better reflects what society values, and that fixed supply allows purchasing power to increase over time, allowing us to have more capacity. That was a little bit of a ramble, but hopefully that answered your question.
Well, one of the things with like free market thing that I struggle with though is because, and you could see this during the COVID period, you know, like with a lot of the mandates and stuff, like stores had to close, small businesses had to close, and so they suffered a lot. And not only that, but you also have the government intervening and they're bailing out companies that should fail. So sometimes I look at it and I'm like, well, like, is it possible, like in my lifetime, for that free market to come back? Because you have a government intervening constantly. You have it's because of the inflation and stuff too, it's becoming harder and harder for like small businesses to start up and to continue to grow, because we're not weaning out those companies that should fail. And it's making it harder for the smaller businesses to be able to employ and to put their products out as well. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And, you know, I would argue that we have maybe never had a true free market ever in history, because even money has been controlled, like money has been controlled by some central authority, whether it's the government, the goldsmiths, you name it, all the way throughout history it has been controlled, which means that they are regulating the flow of money, they are regulating the amount of money in society, and then we've got central banks that are controlling interest rates. So even if we actually had competition and we allowed free market competition to take place, someone is controlling the cost of capital, which is like how much does it cost to actually borrow money, that's interest rates, and someone is controlling where money flows to in society. So I would argue we've never actually had a free market, and COVID is a perfect example of the byproducts or the disadvantageous issues of intervention. So here in Canada, and I know it was very similar in the States, it was very similar in the UK, it was very similar in most Western countries, we ended up having something called the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. Now, if you had earned less than, if you had lost 10% of your income or more during the pandemic, then you were entitled to $2,000 a month. Well, $2,000 a month is $24,000 a year. If you look at the tax receipts in Canada, 30% of Canadians earn under $24,000 a year. So now you've got to ask yourself, okay, if 30% of Canadians earn under $24,000 a year, and now they're being offered $24,000 for free, or they can work full time for that $24,000, which option are they going to take? They're going to take, of course they're going to take the free money, and they're not going to work. And so all of a sudden, you disincentivized working. So 1/3 of basically the population, working population of Canada dropped out and started just focusing on themselves and sitting at home watching Netflix, while all of the mum and pup businesses, all of the low income jobs, all of the waitresses, the waiters, all of the bike shops, the coffee stores, people couldn't find workers. And so we saw countless small businesses go under because they had no workers. And this is a byproduct of people being given free money. People, evolutionarily, we want to conserve energy. So if someone's going to give us something for free, we're not going to go and then work for that same thing. We're just going to stop working. And so this is one of the byproducts of the intervention. And you see it time and time and time again. And so this is where I very much support a removal of money from state and more free market practices which incentivize certain behaviors, such as if we didn't intervene, if we allowed the free market to take place and competition to kind of evolve over time, what would happen is each time we go through a recession, each time we go through a depression, each time we go through a hard time, those that are fiscally responsible and have saved are able to weather that event and come out the other side stronger. Those who haven't will wither away. What that does is it tells society what society values and what society doesn't value. So we're constantly trending towards what it is that society values and value creation. We see the flip side exactly as you said, where we go into these recessions, but because of how much debt we have and because of all of these major companies that are kind of too big to fail, they go into the recession fiscally irresponsible. If they didn't have a bailout, they would collapse, but that collapse would cause so much job loss, that collapse would cause so much pain to society that the government is incentivized to intervene. So they then bail out that company. But now what have you done? You have increased the amount of competition in the market. So the companies that actually were fiscally responsible now have to compete with companies that shouldn't even exist. And you've disincentivized those companies that are actually saving and trying to be fiscally responsible, because why would you put all this energy and effort into saving and being fiscally responsible when you can actually just take risk and that risk is rewarded with intervention? And so you're misaligning the incentives in society. And that's where I really do believe that in order for society to flourish, you need to allow competition to take place, because competition is what allows value to kind of flourish and the cream to kind of rise to the top.
Now, one of the things that I myself kind of struggle with this like free market type of idea, because I know, and I will get to Bitcoin in a minute, but like I feel, and I know this other people have the same feeling, is, you know, people look to government to like try to fix things, but the problem that I'm kind of starting to see all around with that as well is that I don't think that any, you know, the people who keep saying, oh, I'll get in office and change this, nothing changes, because collectively, the left and the right, while they have different views on things, they don't want to get in and tank the government and ruin everything. So their values are still kind of aligned as well, until you can get that middle person in that's going to come and make change, like real change. I feel like in the US, we're just kind of going back and forth between Democrat and Republican, but while they may have strict things on one thing, like collectively, it's all still the same and nothing is changing. And I, like, for me, like, I'm going to admit this and kind of, I know I'm going to make myself sound stupid, but it's okay because I'm learning. I didn't even realize, like, I always thought the Federal Reserve was like part of like our thing, and that it's not, and they're a bunch of crooks, really. And you know, I was actually taking a constitution class recently, and they were talking about one year the Federal Reserve, they had put this bill through, and it went back and forth, and it ended up being, I think, like $70 trillion, and people let it go through. But it ended up being, they didn't even put through all the stuff. So like the real bill was 268 trillion whatever dollars. And so when you like, I do agree that the Federal Reserve has got to go. And also we're in a situation where I think like taxation is theft. It's out of control. Like, we're living in a world where we're taxed to death. And so you pay taxes on your income, and then you pay renters taxes, you pay sales tax, you pay food tax, so you're seeing maybe what, 30-40% of your income. And so sometimes I look at it and go, well, can we really make change until we get someone who's going to come in and intervene and change that, to make it so that the free markets can come in, so that we can align something different. And so I don't know Canada politics as much, but is it similar kind of with that?
So I would say, like, you're very much on point. The one thing that I would lean towards is that people have their own incentives, as we've discussed, and the system also has its own incentives. And so the problem is, if you get an individual who comes in and says, okay, you know what, we're going to go into austerity right now. So for those who aren't familiar, what is austerity? It's kind of, I'm going to live within my means because I've been living so much beyond my means for so long. And we've been borrowing from the future through debt. So I'm just going to live within my means for a long period of time. Now, going into wars in the past, whether it's like World War II, the country was okay to go into austerity because it realized, okay, this is for a bigger cause. We're trying to support the nation here. We want to support the military might, regardless whether you agree with it or not. We want to support the military, so we're going to go into austerity and we're going to live within our means. The problem right now is no one is going to voluntarily go into austerity because of the wealth inequality, because you're seeing just such disparity and there's so much conflict in society. And on top of that, we've got so much debt that if we do try to intervene right now, the system is pretty much going to collapse. Like, when you take like the US, when you take Canada, when you take these Western nations, we're so heavily indebted that it's actually an impossibility that we're able to dig ourselves out of this hole. So debt is going to continually increase year after year after year after year until something shifts. So what is that thing that can shift? Well, I believe that something like Bitcoin it's not an individual coming in and changing the system. It is that when you have this asset that's going to slowly increase in purchasing power over time, more people are going to leave the traditional financial system and move their purchasing power over to Bitcoin. Now, the amazing thing about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is not tangible, it's not physical, so it's not like a house that can be seized or gold, it's not held in a bank, which can be kind of like seized and co-opted. It's also not, even though it's intangible, it's not held by a third party, or it doesn't have to be. So with your stocks, with your bonds, with your pension accounts, they're held by third parties, whether it's BlackRock or whether it's Goldman Sachs or you name it, these kind of major institutions. So if the government wants to seize your assets, they can seize your assets. When it comes to Bitcoin, because you can take custody of your Bitcoin yourself, you can store your purchasing power in Bitcoin. And as Bitcoin continues to grow over here, separate from the traditional financial system, it's going to continually increase kind of awareness as to the failures of our current system. As we see more capital flood over to Bitcoin, well, if those in positions of power want to access that populace, if they want to kind of have the Bitcoiners on their side, well, what do they have to do? They actually have to listen to them. They're not able to freeze their assets. They're not able to take the traditional measures of kind of force. You actually, in order to be able to obtain Bitcoin from someone who is taking custody of their own Bitcoin, they have to offer value, and that individual has to voluntarily hand over Bitcoin. And so what ends up happening is by transitioning from our traditional monetary system, whereby a lot of the system is built upon force. If a country is not supporting the US, well, the US will come in by force. If someone is not listening to or following kind of the legal system, or a group of entities not following the legal system, the US comes in by force. Whereas when you have a large enough population of, large enough kind of segment of the population is like, hey, we don't agree with what is going on, and we control a large portion of the capital in society, and the only way you're going to get that capital is actually to support our positions, I think we're going to be able to see passive change. That is huge. We've never had an asset that's been able to do that before. And the other thing that I think is also interesting to talk about is when people think about capitalism, when they think about the free market, they think about it from this perspective, well, how are we supposed to support those on the bottom rung of society? How can we have social endeavors? How can we have welfare like support? And the thing is, we have that at the moment, and we are seeing growing homelessness. We are seeing growing wealth inequality. Whenever we put these social agendas into practice, what ends up happening is we see an increase in the amount of people that end up using them and a decimation of society. And that's because there's two people in society. There's people that create value, and there's people that capitalize on the people creating value. And so they're taking the value that others are creating and they're dispersing it how they see fit. And so the government, through progressive tax rates, what they're really saying is, hey, if you have a greater capacity to earn money, we're going to take that money and distribute it to those that aren't able to. What that ends up doing is impacting innovation, which that innovation in turn is what would actually help support and lift people out of poverty. So technology helps us advance as a society. It benefits all of us. By actually supporting a free market and supporting that self-interest on the individual's behalf, we actually improve technology that allows others to be able to thrive. Not only that, but I think this one's really, really important. Money, one of the primary goals of money is it's meant to be a store of value. When we work hard, when we kind of use our blood, sweat and tears to be remunerated in money, we want to be confident that, hey, if I save this money and go spend it in a couple years' time, that I'm able to buy the same amount of goods or more than what it is that I could have bought the day that I earned that money. But the problem is, today, money doesn't work like that. Money doesn't allow us to store value effectively. Inflation, rising asset prices, basically make it impossible to save. So what happens? People either consume or they go and dump all of their money into assets. So now people are buying up houses, they're buying up farmland, and these asset prices, their purchasing power these assets, they continue to rise in purchasing power. And so it makes it harder and harder for people to go and purchase. Where I live in Whistler, 61% of the houses are empty. They're just simply being used to store value. They're not being used to put a roof over a family. They're not being used for their original utility value, and it's the same thing with farms. People are buying farmland left, right, and centre, but then they're not using the farm to grow crops and add value to society. They're not using it to raise animals. Instead, they're using it to store value. And so asset prices have skyrocketed because money doesn't store value. If we had a monetary system with a fixed supply, where all of a sudden our purchasing power increased over time, we'd be incentivized once again to simply save in the currency. Now, if we were to save in the currency and we were rewarded for doing so, you would see capital flood out of these traditional assets. You would see capital move from real estate and farmland to the point where I would argue, I wouldn't be surprised if these assets dropped 80, 90% in their value, because people are no longer using them just to store value. They're using them just for their utility value, and then they're using money to store their value. And so under a world where we have a monetary system separate from state with a fixed supply, all of a sudden it ends up supporting those on the bottom rung of society, because it becomes way easier to be able to purchase a home. Rent would be a lot cheaper. If you want to be a farmer and you want to add value to society, you can purchase a farm. On top of that, you're seeing a declining cost of living, because as innovation grows and our ability to harvest vegetables and increase our efficiency and productive workers, you name it, that benefits us. So I believe that under a free market, it is a misunderstanding that free markets are purely just self-interested and only benefit the rich. It's the inverse that is true. When we have a system that can take purchasing power from one area of the economy to the other, we have a system that constantly exacerbates the issues that we're currently facing.
Okay, now with Bitcoin, one of the things that I had asked, someone was doing a thing on YouTube, and I had asked a question, which was the thing that I struggle with is that if people want Bitcoin to be the next currency, there's not a lot of talk about using Bitcoin, but more of saving it and for making it available for future generations. I think Adam says he's saving it for his future name. So my question on this, because something that I found with Bitcoin was, for me looking at it, I was like, okay, Bitcoin, like spendable every day, like trying to incorporate it if it's going to become the new money. I love the lightning aspect to that. However, in the US, every single time I got used to a lightning wallet, it's gone now. And so I know a lot of people in the US are like, well, this is frustrating. And if everyone's just going to keep shutting down, what's the point of trying to have to go learn something new and over again? And I think it was on Graham's YouTube, and he had said people will use, the reason that they save it more is they're going to use the currency that is failing first because it's not worth the value and hold on to the Bitcoin. But what I love about Bitcoin is that it is harder to use, or I found that it's a little bit harder to use, having to move things and wallets and all this stuff. So it does make you think about what you want to purchase, so you're not becoming a product of consumerism as much. But that when you also want to support other people, you're investing in them, because that money that you're giving them is only going to grow. So as someone who's very much into the Bitcoin community, and I know that you, in your book, you only touch about Bitcoin at the end to lead people into it. Now, for people who are wondering why why there's not a lot of talk about using it, and I've even seen some people be like, don't ever use your Bitcoin. And I'm like, how are you going to transfer or convince people to change into a new system and learn it if there's that narrative?
For sure. And, you bring up some interesting points. And what you're referring to when you mentioned you were kind of listening to this guy and he was talking about how people kind of spend their worst money, that's a law called Gresham's law. And Gresham's law is that bad money drives out good, whereby, and I should state, this is only when there are legal tender laws. So legal tender laws, for those that aren't familiar, in the US, there are legal tender laws that say the US dollar is a legal tender. In Canada, we have legal tender laws that say the Canadian dollar is legal tender. And what that means is that if you are a merchant, if you are a service provider, you have to accept that currency. You cannot decline that currency. And so what that means is if you have to accept that currency, people are always going to spend the bad money and hoard the good money. Because why would you save in dollars when you can save in Bitcoin or save in gold or save in these kind of more superior assets? So when there are legal tender laws, we end up driving out good money because people are able to spend bad money. Whereas what's interesting is if we removed legal tender laws and we just allowed a free market, the inverse is actually true. Because if you're a merchant, are you going to come out there and say, you know what, I'm willing to accept the US dollar? No, you're not. You're going to be like, I believe Bitcoin is a superior money, so as a merchant, I'm going to accept Bitcoin. If you want to deal with my goods, you've got to pay me in Bitcoin. So all of a sudden, under a free market, instead of this Gresham's law, bad money drives out good, it's the inverse. Good money drives out bad, and it's called Thier's law. And so under such a scenario, I think Bitcoin would flourish because more and more people would be incentivized to use Bitcoin as more and more companies say, we're only going to accept Bitcoin. Now, what's interesting as well is for that to take place, there needs to be a change in the system. And the change that we need is that at the moment, when you spend Bitcoin, it's a taxable event. So if you've made money in Bitcoin and then you go and spend it, well, now you've got a capital gains. You've got to report that on your taxes. Or if you lost money on Bitcoin, you've got a capital loss. You've got to report that on your taxes. That becomes a hassle to track all of these capital gains and capital losses every single time the moment you spent it. And so at the moment, there's a disadvantage to using Bitcoin just as a medium of exchange. So people primarily saving it. When we see countries like El Salvador, we're seeing a lot more use because they don't have that. The moment you remove Bitcoin from capital gains tax and you're able to transact in it just like any other money, then all of a sudden you now incentivize its use. And so I think that for us to see like widespread adoption, I think that we need to remove capital gains tax so that it can be on par and treated as equal as the US dollar. But I also do believe that as individuals, more than anything, I think that we want to try and incentivize people to use Bitcoin. And so for me, I'm willing to take that capital gains hit or capital gain or capital loss at any moment and record it down on my taxes, just because I realize that, hey, if I'm able to help that bartender and get them saving in Bitcoin, I just help that one individual and get them saving in Bitcoin. That to me outweighs the pros and cons of constantly having to like manage the taxation side of things. And so I'm always for Bitcoiners when you're down that rabbit hole, trying to support others and trying to spend your Bitcoin. And it's also a ton of fun when you go to countries that accept Bitcoin, whether you're in like Madeira, the island off of Portugal, I've been in Honduras, when you're in El Salvador, you can go and spend Bitcoin at like little stores. You can go to the coffee shop, spend Bitcoin. And it's unlike any other currency in the world. Like you can really just like tap a phone and it's there in a second. And it's a non-bearer instrument, which basically means that like it's a bearer instrument, which basically means that like you hold your Bitcoin. It's not a debt. No one else owes it to you. You hold it. It's like holding a gold brick. And so it's phenomenal.
And you started up, you were talking about how you don't mind getting that capital gains to teach and learn. And one of the things that I was super grateful in my journey is, for me, I'm a learner who I have to be hands-on. And I learned almost everything I learned about Bitcoin through Ben Perrin's stuff that he shares on his YouTube. And so grateful for that, because one thing that I love is there's so much information out there. And if you really want to learn, like, you can go and get anything that you want. And you actually built the with some of your friends, I believe, the looking glass. And I've been going through it. You have a whole course, and I'm still working on it in there. And there is so much content. And what I love is for people who choose to like do homeschool, or even like beginners or whatever you want to do, it is amazing what you have created there. So I want to know, like, what inspired you to want to build the looking glass with your friends, and what do you want people to be able to come in and get from that?
That's a really great question, and I appreciate you checking it out. It's like diving into this realm when we talk about like Bitcoin and finance, like it's intimidating. And the challenge that I think we face in society today is that because our money is worth less, people are, as I mentioned, flooding into assets. And then that means that, okay, if I want to be able to actually save, well, I can't just save, I have to invest, so I have to take risk. And so the world in which we live in, we kind of have to kind of do our day job, and then we have to spend a ton of time researching, how do I invest? How do I direct my capital to try and hopefully make it grow? Or we have to pass it off on to some third party, some financial advisor. And so what we really wanted to do through Looking Glass was really just empower individuals to have a better understanding of our monetary system, but again, remove that jargon, speak to the layperson. And so I co-founded Looking Glass with a couple other like incredible individuals, and our whole goal was to speak to that average working individual about Bitcoin, finance, and kind of macroeconomics, like how the world interacts. And we've just been like so humbled by the response to it. And the first course that we released was kind of a bit about like the evolution of money, debt and inflation, and how it's impacting us today, and then what are our options. And we kind of dive into the advantages and disadvantages of Bitcoin and real estate and bonds and gold and kind of these more traditional assets. But then we realized we want to talk a lot more about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is really where our passion lies. So we created a second course called Beers for Bitcoin, which is also a book that's available on Amazon. And that second course kind of just dove into who is Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious founder? How did Bitcoin kind of evolve to be what it is today? And how does it really just work on like a base layer, fundamental kind of like view at it? How does it actually work? And we really speak to the layperson, remove the jargon. And then we realize, okay, we've got these two courses. Let's just combine them together. So we combine the two of them together. So it's a free course and you can jump on. And I think it's just called our Free Foundations course or the Bitcoin course. And it just takes you all the way through the evolution of money, how our current system is structured, what options we have, and then how Bitcoin functions. And we've just been blown away by the response to it. And we just want to make sure that all of our content is kind of just free and accessible. And I would say that, like, to your question, the Looking Glass came out of this passion for just educating. And I came into the space really and started educating in 2020. And I started writing, and that article that you mentioned at the start, When More Isn't Better, Inflation in the 21st Century, was the first time I've ever written anything in my life. And I decided, I was like, you know what? I want to be able to write about why money in its current form is creating wealth inequality. And so I wrote this article, and at the time I think I had 7 followers on Twitter. I posted it on Twitter, and Greg Foss, who for those that don't know is just like an incredibly inspirational individual, Greg Foss and Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation reshared it, and I was blown away, absolutely blown away, from just kind of this lowly little working guy who had 7 followers to kind of getting these idols of mine that had really inspired me to reshare the article. And so from there it kind of ended up snowballing, and I managed to get a few of my articles in magazines, and then that's when we kind of found each other as a little community and we created Looking Glass. And it's really just evolved from there, and our whole goal is just to educate and support people. And the latest endeavor from Looking Glass, we realized, hey, we don't want to just continually write new articles and put out constant new articles, because we have really said what we need to say about our monetary system. And so we started something called CODL, which is kind of a play on words. It's kind of the overprotective approach to self-custody. We want to kind of help people in their self-custody of Bitcoin. And so if people are ever curious about taking custody of their Bitcoin, we're more than happy to walk them through that, and they can just jump on the website to kind of give us a call, and we're happy to jump on a call and discuss that with them.
That's amazing. And in addition to like the courses, you also have pages and pages of like podcast episodes and other articles that are written. And I was blown away by that, because I'm like, there's so much here to listen and learn from. And I love that you put it all together on a site for that. Now, I do want to ask you, because you had mentioned that was your first article that you wrote, and it's written so well. And I want to know like your process of like, how did you become such like an articulate writer? Was it just practice, or?
So you mentioned it, you hit on it at the very, very start. Like, I dropped out of school when I was 14. I hated English. Like, I dropped out of English when I was probably 11 years old. I've never written anything in my life. I think that the way I write is I try to write conversationally. How I would talk to someone and articulate something through conversation is how I kind of tend to put it on paper. And I think through mountain biking, I've been a mountain bike instructor for over a decade. As a mountain bike instructor, our whole goal is to distill down these complex biomechanical movements into its simplest form. Like, how do you teach someone how to do a jump on a mountain bike? How do you teach someone how to corner? But we've got to talk about our foot positioning. We've got to talk about where are your hips. We've got to talk about where are you looking. It's the same thing in finance. It's the same thing with money. I'm trying to distill down these complex like systems. How do countries interact with each other? What is money? What is its role in society? How does it impact us as individuals? And I'm trying to break those down into something simple that people can understand. And so I've always looked at the world through that very like curious lens and trying to piece together the puzzle that is our world. And so I very much try to write from a conversational tone, and I've always liked talking to friends about it. And so I think that it's not necessarily, my writing hasn't developed necessarily through physical writing. I think it's probably developed more through just communicating with friends, trying to teach about it. And that has helped me immensely. And I never ever expected to write a book. Like, it's interesting. My brother studied English. He studied a master's in English literature in university, and he writes like so articulately. And whenever I read his stuff, I'm just blown away by it. And I'm the one who dropped out of school, never went to school, and then I ended up writing a book. And I never expected it in the slightest. But I think that for me, it wasn't about me. It was about like, this is something that I think is really important in society, and people need to understand how money works and influences and weaves its influence throughout society. And that's kind of how it evolved over time. And I would say that I'm still useless Every single time I write anything that I before E with like there or chief, I get them mixed up every single time. And commas, I'm still pretty useless at them. So I use Grammarly to help do my grammar, because otherwise you guys would not be very impressed with my writing.
I'm the same way. I'm like, oh, I'm forgetting all the commas and all the different stuff. So it's crazy. I did actually just want to talk to you about one other thing, because a lot of people have asked you like how you got into Bitcoin, and I'd love for you to share it with my listeners about your bike story, because I think that it's really important. And I do want to ask like a follow-up before you start that too. You've talked about like how you and your brothers are very different. And so have you been able to, are they like part of the Bitcoin community, or is that something that they're not part of once you answer the other question?
For sure. So my passion, as I mentioned, has been mountain biking. So since probably about like 7, 8, 9 years old, I've just been absolutely obsessed with mountain biking. And when I started kind of getting into mountain biking as a kid, naturally I wanted to just kind of watch all of the big mountain bike movies, and you'd see like the Tiger Woods of the mountain bike world on these shows, on these videos. And when I moved out to Canada and I started teaching mountain biking, all of a sudden I started to work alongside these individuals, and I was blown away. I was totally humbled to be able to work alongside these people that as a kid I fully idolized and I put on a pedestal. But what I realized pretty quickly is that these individuals are struggling. Like, most of them don't own their house. Most of them are up to their neck in debt. And these are the individuals that are supposedly at the top of their game, the world's best athletes when it comes to mountain biking. And they're struggling. And that made me realize, I was like, if I want to try and get ahead in life, I can't just pursue mountain biking. I'm going to struggle. And so that's where I really started diving into, okay, I have to look at the financial markets. I have to generate some form of passive income, and that passive income then can support me to show up more authentically and pursue mountain biking, not for its income benefits, but more because that's something that interests me. And so as I went down that rabbit hole, I went down real estate, and then I kind of went into the financial markets, which ultimately led me to Bitcoin. But it really opened my eyes to the complexity of the world and how the world really interweaves, how money really interweaves itself into everything we do. And in hindsight, that's when I started to realize when our money is broken, it impacts us from showing up authentically. And there's a couple other stories that I usually share, and I'll just share one more, which is the fact that like I also in hindsight started to realize, man, it's not just even in my sport. Like I see it from my parents. Like my parents separated at a young age, and I was raised by my mum. And my mum, being a single earner, she had to support my 2 brothers and I. So there was 3 of us. We lived in this kind of 2-bedroom house. My mum had to kind of work her ass off to be able to support us. So all of a sudden you start to realize that when our money is broken and people struggle to survive, then they're not able to meet the emotional needs of their kids to the extent they may like to. My mum had to work longer hours than she would want, and so I spent a lot more time with my peers. And I now see the effects of when parents have to go and work more and their kids spend a lot more time with peers. Well, peers naturally, at a young age, they're going through the world just as you are with fresh eyes. They don't have that experience. They don't have that like North Star, that moral compass that's able to help guide us. And so peers want to sound the same. They want to look the same. They want to have the same mannerisms. And so you end up with a society that kids have not individuated. They don't really know who they are. They don't really know how to show up because they haven't spent enough time around parents that are able to help them individuate and know who they are and stay true to what their values are. And so I really very much believe that as our money breaks down, it's impacting the relationship between parent and child. And in Canada, and I'm sure it's very similar in the States, but in Canada, since 1970, which is when we left the gold standard, to present day, we have seen a doubling of dual earner households where both parents have to work and a halving of single earner households. So what's that telling us? Well, it's telling us that we cannot survive on a single income anymore. Both parents are having to go out and work. And if both parents are working, there's less time with their kids, and that's starting to impact kids in their relationship. And the second question, wait, you were asking me, what was the second question again? I remember you asked me 2 questions.
I love when you shared about when you saved your money to get your mountain bike and you went out with your dad. And I was wondering, like, if you would share that story, and then just do you like you just kind of touched on it with your mom talking about like, you know, growing up and watching her struggle. And sometimes when people grow up and they struggle, they continue in that pattern. And so I want to know, like, for you, what it was like to break out, like how you broke out of that, like what made you want to, and then like, are you and your brothers very similar? Are they involved in Bitcoin as well? Or are you guys on very different paths?
I think you're referring to the scooter. So
Yes.
there was this scooter when I was about 9 years old, and I went to this toy store and I saw the scooter and was just like, I want that scooter. That would be freaking rad. And so I ended up saving for like 3 months. Like I had a paper round. My bike was too light, so the bike kept on flipping over. It was super annoying, but I kind of like eked through this paper round to save up for this scooter. I ended up going in to go purchase this scooter with my dad and my two brothers. And we walked up to the till and my dad was like, oh man, I feel bad that you're getting a scooter and your two brothers aren't. So he ended up purchasing them a scooter and I had to pay for mine. And as a kid, I was like, this is so unfair. Like, this is so frustrating. I feel like I've just worked super hard for this. And I just couldn't fathom what had just happened. And what's interesting is I think that these are those moments that change the trajectory of your life. It had made me question. I felt as if the world felt unfair. Why was the world unfair? And that curiosity, I would argue, is one of those tipping points that made me start questioning the world around me. And what's interesting is that through questioning the world around me and having to work and save to purchase that scooter, I lean more towards kind of libertarian and what's called like Austrian economics. I don't believe in intervention. I believe that we should allow people to grow and pursue their trajectory without external forces constantly regulating their ability to do what they want to do. And what's interesting is I look at my two brothers, and my two brothers were supported a lot more by my dad. They were supported whereby my dad would help them out more financially. My dad would support them in those ways that ended up, I would argue, impacting their political leanings, because now when I see them, they're far more left-leaning. They're not libertarian. They lean way more socialist and way more interventionistic, and they rely more on handouts. And then I also see how it's impacted their life and how they're showing up. And what's interesting is I very much believe that how our parents, and this is probably relatively evident, but how our parents raise us and how our parents intervene greatly influences how we therefore then show up in the world and our political leanings. Now, what's interesting is, and that was the question actually you asked me earlier, it's like, when it comes to my brothers, are they Bitcoiners? Neither of them are Bitcoiners. And the interesting thing is, they will not read any of my stuff. They have never read, even my brother, who is, as I mentioned, he's got a master's in English literature. He refuses to read my stuff. He thinks Bitcoin is like the devil. And so over the years, I have started to realize that when it comes to supporting people along their Bitcoin journey, I'm not that individual to try and push and push and push and push and break through and orange pill someone into Bitcoin. Instead, I'm that person that, hey, when there's a glimmer of curiosity, I'm there to chat about it. And I'm willing to talk about it from whatever perspective. And I very much recognize as an educator that in order to be able to educate and support someone's curiosity, first off, you have to understand their pain points. What is it about our current system that is painful to them? And you've got to structure that discussion around those pain points. Because let's say you're talking to a single mum. She probably doesn't want to know what quantitative easing is and quantitative tightening is. Or let's say you're talking to an economist. They probably don't want to know how money is impacting childhood growth. And so breaking down our argument and surrounding kind of the pain points that someone is feeling is really important. And then only after someone understands kind of why the system is creating the challenges that they're facing, then you bring in the solution, which is something like Bitcoin. And I think the challenge with Bitcoin is that most of the time we bring Bitcoin in first before the other person actually understands the problems and why our current monetary system is creating those problems. So I very much support, like anyone who's listening to this, if we're trying to kind of push someone along on their Bitcoin journey, but they're not quite there yet, focus more on the pain points and the problems with the current system as opposed to pushing Bitcoin. Because if they don't understand the problems, they're never going to understand the solution.
I love that. And I think also if they don't want to learn it, they're not going to either. So it's
absolutely,
what's that saying? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Absolutely.
Kind of that. Thank you so much for this, Seb. I want to be mindful of your time. Where can people find you? And is there anything that you want to leave with my audience? Any final words?
I would say, like, if you're curious and just kind of learning more about everything that kind of we've been discussing, you can just pop onto like sebbunny.com, and Bunney is Bunney. And you've got it's got a list of kind of all of my kind of various media appearances, and it's also got a link to the book that we've been discussing. And so the book is The Hidden Cost of Money, and it kind of just dives into how money really does weave its influence into all of these aspects, whether it's our environment, whether it's our families, whether it's our politics, whether it's our businesses, whether it's our history. And I would also say that I never want price to be a deterrent to people's learning. And so if someone is listening to this and they're like, oh man, I'd love to read that, but I'm not in a financial position to purchase the book, if you just go on my website and reach out, or you can find me on Twitter at sebbunny.com, sebbunny, you just reach out and I'm more than happy to send you the ebook, because I want to make sure that everyone has access, and I don't think price should impact someone's learning journey. But outside of that, I would just say, like, I hugely appreciate you having me on, Laurie, and it's really nice to kind of bring these conversations kind of back to kind of reality and kind of ground them, because I think so many times when we talk about money, it's easy to just find ourselves up in the clouds talking about these like philosophical ideas and talking about like technology, or talking about kind of the like mechanics of money, and it's bland. I find it bland, and so it's nice to kind of bring it back to reality and talk about how it really impacts us. So I really appreciate you having me on.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.